Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're embarking on a crucial journey, a really deep dive into a landscape that's, well, become increasingly complex and frankly vital for many of you listening. Imagine you're running a US-based multinational company, right? And you've strategically set up significant back-office operations over in Hungary. A lot of companies have.
Quite a few, yes. It's been a popular spot.
Exactly. So the big question we're unpacking today is, what do the current political currents, the economic realities,
Yeah.
the social shifts happening in Hungary really mean for your business, for your dedicated employees on the ground, and, crucially, for your strategic planning going forward?
Yeah.
We're going to try and distill the essential factors and, importantly, the potential risks you absolutely need on your radar right now.
That's precisely our mission for this deep dive. Our goal is really to cut through, the considerable noise surrounding Hungary these days.
There's a lot of it.
There really is. And bring you the critical, actionable insights. We've been looking at the latest analyses, pretty comprehensive economic reports, and various political forecasts.
Okay.
We're going to synthesize all this information, try to give you a clear, well-informed picture of what's genuinely important for your Hungarian operations, especially as we head towards those pivotal 2026 elections, and frankly, look well beyond that time frame.
Right, the longer-term view.
Exactly. We'll be meticulously scrutinizing how these, dramatic political shifts can directly impact everything from your day-to-day operations, your valued workforce, right down to your long-term investment decisions and your overall regional strategy. It touches everything.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Section 1. The shifting political landscape. For what feels like an eternity in modern politics, Prime Minister Viktor Orban's Fidesz-KDNP coalition has just been the undisputed heavyweight champion of Hungarian politics. I mean, they've established formidable dominance.
Absolutely dominant.
But our sources are suggesting something profound is underway, maybe a significant, perhaps even a tectonic shift. And it seems largely driven by the unexpected and, frankly, meteoric rise of a new player, the Tisza party. So what exactly is going on here? What's fueling this?
Yeah, what's truly fascinating, I think, is the speed and the unexpected nature of this challenge. Peter Magyar, the individual right at the heart of this Tisza party's ascent, was, until very recently, largely an unknown quantity to the general public.
Right, not a household name.
Not at all. Despite being a former government insider, his emergence into public consciousness really kicked off around February 2024, and it followed that clemency scandal that absolutely rocked the Hungarian political establishment.
I remember that. It was huge news.
It was massive. This wasn't just a minor blip. It involved the high-profile resignations of President Katalin Novak and the former Justice Minister Judith Varga. And it was all over a controversial pardon related to a child abuser's cover-up.
Just awful.
A moment of real national outrage. And Magyar, being Judith Varga's ex-husband, found himself kind of thrust into this unforgiving spotlight.
And he didn't just quietly slip into that spotlight, did he? He seemed to arrive with a bang.
Oh, not at all. Magyar's initial public appearances, particularly a YouTube interview back in February 2024, were nothing short of explosive. He didn't just, stand by his ex-wife. He went on to hint very strongly at possessing intimate knowledge of internal Fidesz operations.
Oh, the insider angle.
Exactly. And alleged widespread corruption within the government's ranks. Now, this immediately resonated with the public already gripped by the pardon controversy and, frankly, a growing sense of disillusionment.
Sure.
His accusations, coming from someone who had been on the inside, carried this unique weight. It immediately seized public attention, fueling speculation, and a huge surge of interest in his nascent political message.
And the numbers, I mean, when you look at the polls, they seem to back up the extraordinary impact he's had. The shifts are quite staggering, aren't they?
They really are. When we look at recent data from, say, May polls, the Tisza party is actually showing a notable lead over the Fidesz-KDNP coalition. Among determined voters, the ones who say they'll definitely vote, Tisza stands at an impressive 43%.
Wow.
While Fidesz-KDNP trails at 34%. That's a significant 9 percentage point difference right there.
That's substantial.
And what's even more remarkable is a more recent median poll, this one from June 18th, 2025. So very current. This poll indicates an even wider gap. Tisza surges to 51%.
Over half.
Over half among decided voters, yeah. And Fidesz slips further to 36%. Now, this isn't just a statistical anomaly. It represents a really profound shift in public
It
sentiment.
feels different this time.
It does. For the first time in like 2 decades, most people polled now genuinely expect Tisza to win the next election. This is a complete departure from the past where polls reliably predicted Fidesz victories, often with little room for doubt, and they were usually right. This psychological shift among the electorate is, in itself, a powerful indicator of changing dynamics.
Okay, so Fidesz is clearly feeling the immense pressure from this unexpected and accelerating challenge. How are they responding? Because our sources indicate they're pulling out all the stops, countermeasures, tactics. It sounds pretty aggressive.
Oh, they are. And their response can really be characterized as a potent authoritarian backlash. This isn't just about political maneuvering. It involves a systematic effort to, well, intimidate critics, actively altering the electoral playing field to their advantage.
Tilting the board.
Precisely. And launching a concerted, often very personal campaign to smear Peter Magyar. Prime Minister Orbán himself publicly promised an Easter time cleaning.
Ominous phrasing.
Very. To rid the country of what he chillingly referred to as bugs. Now, this wasn't just rhetoric. It was a thinly veiled threat aimed squarely at critical NGOs, independent media outlets, and even judges who've dared to voice criticism of the government.
And for a U.S. multinational operating there, that kind of overt intimidation, that must create a chilling effect, right, on local partners, maybe even employees?
Yeah, absolutely. It creates a difficult atmosphere for anyone seen as critical, which can definitely spill over into the business community and impact relationships with local entities or even just the general civic space.
So Easter time cleaning. What does that actually entail in practice beyond the rhetoric? How are they operationalizing that threat?
Well, one of the most concerning and widely criticized measures is this Russian-style foreign agent bill. Its official title is quite benign, on the transparency of public life.
It sounds harmless enough.
Doesn't it? But its implications are anything but transparent for civil society. This bill, which is expected to pass, or may have just passed around mid-June 2025, grants the Sovereignty Protection Office, or SPO, which is led by Fidesz loyalists, by the way, sweeping powers.
Okay.
It can essentially blacklist any foreign-funded organization deemed to threaten the country's sovereignty. And the definition of threat is incredibly broad.
How broad are we talking?
We're talking anything that might influence public opinion or, quote, negatively portray Hungary's independent character, national unity, or Christian culture. That level of ambiguity and control is, well, it seems designed to silence dissenting voices.
And what are the concrete consequences for organizations that get blacklisted under this bill?
Yeah.
You mentioned working with local partners. This sounds particularly worrying for a multinational.
The consequences are indeed severe, and they seem designed to cripple these organizations financially and operationally.
How so?
Blacklisted organizations would face multiple punitive measures. First, they'd be barred from accepting any foreign funding without explicit state authorization. Second, they'd lose eligibility for that crucial 1% allocation of personal income tax that's a significant source of donations for many NGOs in Hungary.
Right, that's a big funding stream.
Huge. And third, anyone donating to them would have to formally declare that the funds are not from abroad, creating this kind of bureaucratic deterrent. But most strikingly, if an organization is found to have accepted foreign funding without permission, it could face crippling fines up to 25 times the accepted sum.
25 times.
Yeah. This bill has been widely and vehemently denounced by NGOs, human rights organizations, media outlets across Europe. It poses an existential threat to watchdogs, independent researchers, critical voices within Hungary, and it makes it inherently risky for any foreign entity, including businesses, to engage with them.
It really sounds like they're trying to fundamentally shift the ground rules, not just for NGOs, but for the entire political landscape. Are they also making direct changes to the electoral system itself, trying to disadvantage new challengers like Tisza?
Yes, they are. They're actively, let's say, manipulating the very mechanisms of democracy. Back in December 2024, the governing majority controversially redrew 39 out of Hungary's 106 single mandate districts.
Gerrymandering, essentially.
That's the term. This move strategically reduced the number of seats in Budapest, which typically leans towards the opposition, and carved up opposition-friendly suburbs. Meanwhile, Fidesz-heavy constituencies were left largely untouched. It's a clear attempt to engineer electoral outcomes.
Right.
Not very. And there have also been ideas floated, though not yet officially enacted, like shifting back to a 2-round majoritarian system, or maybe even lowering the parliamentary threshold for party representation.
How would those help Fidesz?
Well, Both of these changes could significantly disadvantage a single dominant challenger like the Tisza party. A two-round system might give Fidesz a chance to consolidate votes in the second round. A lower threshold could allow smaller, fragmented parties to gain seats, splitting the opposition vote, and potentially making it easier for Fidesz to secure victory even without a clear majority of the popular vote.
Okay, so systemic changes, the foreign agent law,
Hmm.
are they also directly attacking Magyar himself, trying to neutralize the threat by targeting the leader personally?
Absolutely. The attacks on Peter Magyar have been direct, personal, and relentless. In April 2025, a specific law was passed seemingly out of the blue that allows the National Election Office to revoke an MEP's mandate for alleged asset disclosure errors.
An MEP like Magyar.
Exactly.
Given its exclusivity to European deputies and its highly convenient timing, this measure appears specifically tailored to target Magyar, who is, indeed, an MEP. Furthermore, decade-old insider trading allegations against him have been controversially reopened, with parallel criminal probes launched.
Old allegations brought back now.
Right. These cases, regardless of their ultimate merit, can easily drag through the entire campaign period, creating this cloud of suspicion and distraction, whether or not they ever lead to an actual indictment. For a U.S. multinational watching this, such politicized legal actions really highlight the risks of an increasingly, shall we say, weaponized legal system. And on top of these legal and systemic measures, there are the pervasive smear campaigns you mentioned, painting a very particular, often negative picture of Tisza and Magyar. What's the narrative Fidesz is pushing through its considerable media apparatus?
That's right. The Fidesz propaganda machine is operating at full throttle, and their narrative is quite clear and consistent. Tisza is aggressively branded as a party of Brussels.
The classic Orban line.
The classic line. An entity allegedly kept alive and financed from abroad, implying foreign interference in Hungary's sovereignty. This narrative frames the upcoming 2026 election not just as a choice between domestic parties, but as this existential struggle to decide whether, quote, Brussels will or Hungary's national interest will prevail.
Us versus them.
Fundamentally, they accuse Tisza of supporting the continued suspension of those crucial EU funds, portraying them as subordinate to the European People's Party. And perhaps most strategically, they accuse Tisza of supporting Ukraine's EU entry.
Why is that strategic?
Because Fidesz claims this would lead to a catastrophic loss of EU resources for Hungary. It's a fear tactic aimed squarely at their voter base, playing on economic anxieties. The instrumentalization of Ukraine goes even further. Recently, a Fidesz parliamentary faction leader suggested Tisza was even colluding with Ukrainian intelligence, a completely baseless accusation, but amplified across all pro-government media channels.
Wow.
These messages are designed not only to brand Magyar as a foreign agent, but also to galvanize Fidesz's nationalist base. And crucially, it seems designed to pre-justify any harsher legal or administrative actions by framing the entire election as this desperate struggle for national sovereignty.
Okay, so we've covered Fidesz's aggressive counter-campaign. Let's pivot now to Tisza's side. What exactly is their platform, and what are their vulnerabilities given this intense, often personal opposition?
Tisza's platform is quite ingenious in its appeal, actually. Magyar describes himself as neither a rightist nor a leftist, but rather a Hungarian.
Trying to transcend the usual divides.
Exactly. This centrist populist approach has truly resonated with a broad spectrum of voters, consciously moving beyond those traditional ideological lines. His primary focus is on replacing what he calls the ruling elite, tapping into widespread frustration with perceived corruption and cronyism.
A common populist theme.
A very effective one here. This strategy has successfully built a broader coalition than any opposition force has managed to assemble since 2010 when Fidesz came to power. His key pledges are direct criticisms of Fidesz, highlighting their governance failures, economic mismanagement, pervasive corruption, and cronyism.
And importantly for international observers.
Right. Crucially for international observers and potentially for businesses relying on EU frameworks, Magyar pledges to join the European Public Prosecutor's Office, the EPPO, which is designed to combat fraud against the EU budget.
Which Hungary hasn't joined.
Correct. And he pledges to secure the release of those vital frozen EU funds. These are potent promises, appealing both to anti-corruption sentiment and the desire for economic revitalization.
He's promising to tackle issues that have been deep, long-standing sore points for many Hungarians, particularly that lack of EU funds. But what about the party's internal structure? Is it as robust and broad-based as its public support suggests, or is it maybe too reliant on Magyar himself?
This is perhaps TISA's most significant vulnerability. Despite its broad popular support and the impressive rapid development of these countrywide TISA islands, which are essentially local organizations challenging Fidesz's deeply entrenched organizational monopoly, the party's popularity remains overwhelmingly dependent on Magyar personally.
The charismatic leader phenomena.
Very much so. He is, to put it simply, the face, the voice, and the engine of the movement. There are really no other strong, recognizable public faces that have been built up yet to provide a robust leadership structure beyond him.
So a single point of failure, potentially.
Potentially, yes. This heavy reliance makes the party incredibly vulnerable to targeted attacks against its leader. Any successful blow, legal, personal, whatever, or prolonged legal challenge against Magyar could, in effect, decapitate the party, halting its momentum and chances. Additionally, the very ideological heterogeneity of its voters, while a strength in building that broad coalition, may prove challenging when it comes to translating those popular slogans into concrete, detailed policy programs as the election gets closer. That transition can be tricky.
And what's TISA's stance on foreign policy, especially compared to Fidesz's increasingly, well, Eurosceptic and east-leaning posture?
TISA advocates for staunchly pro-European Union policies. This presents a direct and stark contrast with Fidesz's well-known Euroscepticism and its emphasis on national sovereignty above all else.
A clear alternative there.
A very clear alternative. Magyar specifically supports EU positions on issues like free migration, which is a highly contentious topic in Hungary, and perhaps most significantly, continued support for Ukraine against Russia. This is a crucial ideological divide that clearly distinguishes them from the current government and signals a potential shift back towards mainstream European alignment. For Western businesses, that might be seen as a potentially more stable and predictable direction.
It truly sounds like we're witnessing the emergence of what our sources call a two-party system in Hungary, maybe for the first time since the end of communism. What does that actually look like on the ground? Is the old opposition just fading away?
It's a genuinely significant development, yeah. It's reshaping the entire political landscape. TISA has effectively absorbed the support from most of the smaller opposition parties, completely overshadowing them to become the dominant anti-Fidesz force.
Any examples?
Sure. The radical left-wing Momentum movement, once a significant opposition voice, announced back in June 2025 that it will not even participate in the 2026 elections.
Wow, just stepping out completely.
Completely. This decision largely stems from their consistent polling below that crucial 5% threshold needed to get seats in parliament. They're effectively acknowledging TISA's dominance. Even former Prime Minister Ferenc Gyurcsány of the Democratic Coalition, a long-standing and influential figure in opposition politics, is reportedly stepping aside, recognizing TISA as the new focal point of anti-government sentiment.
So it's consolidating.
It really is. And this remarkable consolidation means that in Hungary's single-round electoral system, which inherently strengthens the strongest party voters, might increasingly be forced into tactical voting, essentially choosing between Fidesz and TISA as the only viable options.
Squeezing out the middle or smaller parties.
Exactly. If other non-TISA opposition parties remain fragmented and choose to run independently, it could inadvertently split the anti-Fidesz vote, making it easier for Fidesz to win constituencies, even with a lower overall popular vote percentage. This tactical dynamic is absolutely critical for understanding the upcoming election.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, maybe even a bit murky. The role of external actors. Our sources suggest that U.S. and European interference, or at least influence, in Hungarian politics has intensified quite a bit since 2010. How is this playing into the current political climate?
Indeed, it's a layer of complexity that you really can't ignore. There's a strong perception among some political factions, and frankly, is a significant portion of the public, that Peter Magyar represents foreign forces.
Like who?
Specifically, the European Union and American Democrats who are actively seeking to undermine and ultimately overthrow Prime Minister Orbán. Now, this narrative is fueled by certain revelations. Recently released documents regarding the activities of the United States Agency for International Development, USAI. These reveal that since 2008, over $842.7 million has been channeled from USAID, often through EU structures and George Soros foundations, to various green left NGOs and media outlets. Now, these are precisely the organizations that some believe have actively facilitated Magyar's rapid rise. This data, which only became public relatively recently, since mid-February, raises significant questions for some about the truly organic nature of his ascent. It feeds directly into Fidesz's narrative of external meddling and threats to national sovereignty.
So for a U.S. multinational operating there, being aware of these perceptions is crucial, right?
Yeah.
It could influence how the government views foreign entities.
Absolutely. It shapes the narrative and can definitely influence public opinion and governmental attitudes towards foreign businesses, NGOs, or any perceived external influence. It's part of the operating context.
So there's this suggestion of a coordinated effort, or at least a convenient alignment of interests. And how does Donald Trump's potential influence play into Orban's broader strategy,
Right.
especially given Hungary's increasingly complex relationship with the West and its pivot east?
Right. Prime Minister Orban has explicitly placed significant hopes on Donald Trump's potential election victory in the U.S. He seems to believe it could drastically improve Hungary's international standing and diplomatic leverage within what he sees as a more multipolar world order.
A friendly face in the White House, potentially.
That's the calculation. The USAI disclosures we just discussed are seen by some within Orban's circle as providing indirect support for his long-standing narrative that Magyar and the opposition are foreign-backed entities. This framing helps Orban mobilize his base and justify his government's more assertive measures.
But there's a tension point, isn't there, with China?
A huge potential tension point, yes. Orban's recent, very deliberate economic pivot towards China, attracting substantial Chinese investment in key sectors like electric vehicle manufacturing, could create significant friction with American interests, regardless of who occupies the White House. This balancing act between securing Chinese capital and navigating U.S. geopolitical concerns adds another layer of complexity for any U.S. multinational operating in that space.
Caught in the middle, potentially. And on the European side, is there a counterbalance? Are they also trying to shape Hungary's political trajectory?
Oh, absolutely. The European People's Party, the EPP, which is a major political group in the European Parliament, and its leader, Manfred Weber, they view Magyar as a very real potential future prime minister.
They see him as an alternative.
A viable pro-European alternative. Their strategic aim, it seems, is multifaceted. They likely want to leverage Magyar's rise to push Hungary back towards a more aligned European path, perhaps compensating for any perceived loss of U.S. support should Trump win, and definitely to reestablish a more constructive relationship with Budapest.
So pressure from Brussels, too.
Definitely. Our sources suggest that the EU leadership is doing pretty much everything within its power to complicate matters for Prime Minister Orban and Fidesz, seeing Magyar as a legitimate pro-European option. So you have this very complex and dynamic dance of external influences with various powerful actors, the US, the EU, potentially China, Russia in the background, each trying to shape Hungary's political future, and that inevitably spills over into the economic and business environment.
Right, and if we connect this political turbulence to the bigger picture, the profound uncertainty we've just discussed isn't happening in a vacuum, is it?
No, definitely not.
It's playing out against this backdrop of significant and, frankly, escalating economic challenges in Hungary, both domestically driven and globally influenced. This precarious economic environment directly impacts every aspect of a multinational company's operations there, from daily costs to long-term investment viability.
All right. Let's start with the global economic environment then. What are the major headwinds that Hungary, as such an export-oriented economy, is facing? How are they contributing to this widespread economic uncertainty? Well, the global economic outlook has, unfortunately, been steadily deteriorating. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, revised its global GDP growth forecasts down significantly. They're now expecting only about 2.8% for 2025.
That's quite a drop.
It's a notable drop from the more optimistic 3.5, 3.6% they projected just back in January. And this downward revision is largely attributed to renewed trade wars and heightened policy uncertainty across the globe.
Trade wars again?
Yes. As the director of the IMF Research Department pointed out, if these increasing trade tensions and this pervasive uncertainty are sustained, they will significantly slow global growth. And that leads to postponed international investments worldwide.
Which means less capital flowing into places like Hungary.
Precisely. Less capital flowing into emerging markets like Hungary, and just a general climate of caution for businesses considering expansion anywhere. It makes everyone more risk-averse.
So trade wars are clearly a major factor. How directly does that impact Hungary, given its economy is so heavily reliant on exports, particularly to the West?
Hungary's economy is highly vulnerable to rising trade protectionism, yeah? Particularly the lingering threat of steep U.S. tariffs on EU imports. Directly, somewhere between 10% and 20% of Hungary's exports, primarily high-value stuff like machinery, electronics, automotive products, go to the U.S.
The decent chunk.
Decent chunk. In 2024, it accounted for about 3.9% of Hungary's total domestic exports, and reductions are explicitly expected because of these tariffs. But the impact extends far beyond just direct trade.
The ripple effects.
Exactly. We're looking at significant second-round effects. Germany, for instance, it's Hungary's single biggest export partner, takes about 25% of its exports.
A quarter of all exports. Wow.
Yeah, huge. And the Bundesbank forecasts Germany is facing a slight recession this year. Now, this isn't just Germany's problem. It will have profound indirect impacts on Hungary's economy because their supply chains are so deeply integrated, particularly in automotive and manufacturing.
So when Germany slows down,
When Germany sneezes, Hungary catches a cold, as the saying goes. The European Central Bank, the ECB, they project only minimal Eurozone growth, too, a meager 0.9% for 2025, citing this persistent geopolitical and policy uncertainty. They also noted that the deteriorating competitiveness of Eurozone economies will likely lead to further declines in the region's overall export share, creating an even tougher external market for Hungarian goods.
and how does all this global uncertainty, especially the threat of new trade wars, affect capital flows into a country like Hungary? Particularly for a multinational looking to either invest more or maybe repatriate profits.
Well, the general uncertainty on the eve of potentially escalating trade wars creates a flight to safety among investors. Capital tends to seek safe havens during periods like this.
So money leaves riskier markets.
It can mean a significant cessation or even a reversal of capital flow for more volatile emerging markets like Hungary. This manifests as, the withdrawal of existing loans, pulling back on investments, and it has a negative effect on local foreign exchange rates, often leading to currency depreciation.
Which impacts the bottom line for a U.S. company.
Absolutely. For a multinational, this directly impacts the cost of doing business, the value of your local assets, and the profitability of converting Hungarian forints back into U.S. dollars. It adds a significant layer of financial instability and exchange rate risk to your operations.
Okay, so moving from those global economic currents to the local reality, what does Hungary's economic performance actually look like in 2024, 2025, given these international pressures and its own internal dynamics?
Well, Hungary's economy has been struggling with a prolonged period of stagnation, really. In the first quarter of 2025, the national output was effectively unchanged from a year ago. Flat.
Not great.
Not great at all. The annual GDP growth for the entirety of 2024 was a meager 0.6%, and the fourth quarter of 2024 showed growth of only 1%.
Barely moving.
Barely moving. While some sectors, like services, saw modest growth, others, crucially, agriculture and manufacturing actually contracted significantly. Agriculture down 10.4%, manufacturing down 4.4% in 2024.
And for a U.S. multinational with manufacturing or supply chain links there?
It means reduced domestic demand, a less dynamic local market, and potential ripple effects through your supply chain from these underperforming sectors. It's an economy that's, barely treading water right now.
That's quite a slow pace, especially for an aspiring EU economy. What about the government's own projections for growth? Are they realistic, or are they maybe painting a rosier picture than reality suggests?
The government's projections, unfortunately, lean heavily towards the optimistic side. They expect growth to accelerate quite substantially to 4.1% in 2026.
That's a big jump from 0.6%.
A huge jump, up from a projected 2.5% for 2025. And it's worth noting that even that 2.5% target for 2025 has already been lowered once and is currently under revision again.
So even the lowered target might be missed.
It suggests a struggle to meet even those reduced expectations, yeah. In stark contrast, the OECD forecasts significantly lower growth. They're predicting just 0.9% for 2025 and 2.4% for 2026. Much more muted.
A big difference.
A very big difference. And the chairman of the Fiscal Council, which is an independent body in Hungary, has explicitly warned that these optimistic growth assumptions pose significant risks to the 2026 budget. He questioned whether planned tax cuts for families can be reliably financed by stronger growth.
So for your business, that signals potential fiscal instability. Maybe unpredictable policy shifts if revenue targets are missed.
Exactly. It increases the risk of sudden tax changes or spending cuts down the line if the growth doesn't materialize as hoped.
And inflation. That's been a persistent, stubborn problem for Hungary, hasn't it?
Yeah.
How is that still impacting the economy and, crucially, operating costs for businesses?
Yes, Hungary has unfortunately faced some of the highest and most persistent inflation rates in the EU. It averaged a staggering 17% in 2023.
17%.
Yeah, really high. While it has thankfully fallen to 4.7% annually in March 2025, that's still considerably above the central bank's target of around 3%.
Still high.
Still quite high. And crucially, services at 7.5% and food at 7.0% continue to be the primary drivers of these price increases. That directly impacts the cost of living for your employees and the operational costs for your business if you rely on local services.
Right.
The central bank is aiming for 3% inflation, but the current rate indicates a considerable struggle. The government has tried to intervene with measures like price freezes on about 30 food products, and they've signaled potential price caps for services like insurance.
Price caps. How does that affect businesses?
Well, while intended to alleviate consumer burden, these interventions introduce significant unpredictability for businesses. Such measures could easily expand to other sectors, limiting your pricing flexibility and potentially impacting your profitability. The central bank has also had to pause further interest rate cuts because of this persistent inflation, keeping the policy rate at 6.5%, even though the economy desperately needs a boost to investment.
Speaking of investment, what's the picture there? Is Hungary still attracting the kind of capital it needs for long-term growth and modernization?
Investment has indeed been declining, which is a key concern for long-term growth prospects. It fell by a substantial 13.8% in 2024 compared to 2023.
Down nearly 14%. That's huge.
It is, with particular weakness observed in critical sectors like transportation, storage, and real estate. In the fourth quarter of 2024 alone, investment fell by 2.2% quarter on quarter. This sustained weakness in investment indicates a lack of confidence in future economic prospects and a slowdown in capacity expansion. That can constrain future growth and competitiveness for the entire economy, not just specific sectors.
So for a multinational considering expanding its footprint, this trend is definitely a red flag.
It's certainly something to watch very closely, yes.
Now let's talk about fiscal stability and the elephant in the room, the crucial issue of EU funds. How is Hungary managing its budget? And what's the current status of that multi-billion euro package from Brussels? This seems like a major determinant of economic health.
This raises an absolutely critical question for any multinational operating in Hungary, you're right. Hungary's parliament recently approved the 2026 budget with a deficit target of 3.7% of GDP. Okay. However, analysts across the board widely consider this target unsustainable.
Why unsustainable?
Especially given the mounting election year spending pressures like those planned tax cuts for families we mentioned. The 2025 deficit target has already been revised upward from an initial 3.7% to 4.1%. Some independent projections even see it reaching as high as 4.8%. This growing credibility gap between the government's fiscal targets and the likely real outcomes is a significant concern for financial markets and investors. It signals potential future instability.
And what about the country's reserves? Are there sufficient funds set aside to cover unexpected events, or is the budget running on very thin margins?
Unfortunately, the budget seems to be operating on very thin margins. The 2026 budget includes only HUF 192 billion, that's roughly 470 million in general reserves.
Doesn't sound like much for a national budget.
It's deemed woefully insufficient by analysts to offset the mounting risks we've discussed. Potential EU fund shortfalls, unpredictable wage policy uncertainties, fallout from global trade wars, you name it. The Fiscal Council has highlighted this lack of fiscal buffer as a significant and immediate concern. It means the government has very little room to maneuver if unforeseen economic shocks occur, potentially leading to emergency austerity measures or, worse for businesses, new sudden taxes.
Okay, and the multi-billion euro package of EU funds, that massive amount, what's the current status of that crucial lifeline? Is any of it flowing?
Well, Hungary's contentious relationship with the EU, primarily over these persistent rule of law concerns, has led to the ongoing suspension of a staggering 22.5 billion in EU structural aid.
22.5 billion euros. Still suspended.
Still largely suspended, yes. This isn't just theoretical. It means a massive amount of development and investment capital is being withheld. This suspension not only directly impacts public investment in crucial areas like infrastructure, education, and innovation, but it also weighs heavily on overall investor confidence. It signals a lack of institutional certainty.
And the EU is still pushing on this.
Oh, yes. The European Commission has formally proposed initiating an excessive deficit procedure against Hungary due to its large budget deficit in 2023, which hit 6.7% of GDP, and they explicitly flagged ongoing deficiencies in rule of law and anti-corruption frameworks. The absence of new, concrete measures from Budapest to remedy these issues means funds remain suspended under several critical programs, depriving the economy of a crucial stimulus and creating this cloud of uncertainty for future planning.
And how is all this impacting Hungary's national debt? Is it becoming an increasingly heavy burden? What are the implications of that for the broader financial landscape, maybe for borrowing costs?
Hungary's debt is indeed a growing concern. It's already among the highest in the EU outside the Eurozone, and it saw a slight increase last year. The surge in the deficit during the first 4 months of 2025 prompted the government to raise the 2025 deficit target again, and crucially, to borrow an additional $4 billion from international markets.
$4 billion more?
Yes. And this pushed Hungary's foreign currency debt above a critical 30% threshold. This increased reliance on foreign currency borrowing adds significantly to exchange rate volatility risk. If the forint weakens against the dollar or euro, debt servicing becomes more expensive.
And rating agencies notice this.
They certainly do. S&P Global, a major credit rating agency, downgraded Hungary's sovereign rating outlook to negative back in April 2025, citing precisely these fiscal and external stability risks. They explicitly warned that a continued loose fiscal stance or weaker than expected economic growth could lead to a further downgrade, which would make borrowing even more expensive for the government and potentially for Hungarian businesses too.
So even though the external balance has improved a bit,
Right. While Hungary's external balance has shown some improvement, there was a current account surplus of 2.2% of GDP and some robust FDI inflows, particularly from non-Western sources like China. The overall fiscal picture remains challenging and precarious due to these persistent issues of deficits, debt, and suspended EU funds. It's a complex mix.
okay. So after that comprehensive look at the political and economic landscape, wow, quite a picture. What does all of this mean for your day-to-day operations and your workforce in Hungary? Let's zoom in on the practicalities of operating a back office or shared service center there.
Yeah, it's interesting because what's fascinating here is that despite the political turbulence we've outlined and the significant economic uncertainties, Hungary remarkably maintains several enduring attractive features, specifically for back office functions and shared service centers often called GBS or GCCs.
So there are still compelling reasons to be there.
There are. These advantages have kept the country a relevant player in the global outsourcing market, even with all the headwinds.
Okay, starting with location. Hungary is often touted as a strategic hub for global operations. Why is that? And what are the tangible benefits for, say, coordinating international teams?
It truly is a geographically blessed location in many ways. Hungary is strategically positioned right at the crossroads of 3 of Europe's critical transport corridors. It effectively connects Eastern and Western Europe, both physically and digitally.
The time zone advantage.
That's a huge part of it. This central geographical advantage, crucially, means its time zone allows for seamless morning calls with Asian countries, think India or the Philippines, and productive afternoon calls with the U.S. That makes it an almost ideal place to establish a central business hub for global operations that require that kind of round-the-clock connectivity. Budapest, in particular, has leveraged this really well, becoming a well-established magnet for multinational enterprises looking to consolidate operations.
And what about the workforce? That's absolutely critical for complex back-office operations like finance, HR, IT support. Does Hungary have the talent needed for those roles?
Absolutely. This is another key strength. Hungary boasts a highly educated workforce, with a particularly strong and growing focus on STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and math.
Skills that are in high demand globally.
Exactly. Multinational companies consistently report that Hungarian professionals are not only eager to learn new skills and adapt to international best practices, but they are also remarkably quick to understand and implement complex new concepts. That's invaluable for sophisticated back-office processes. The country also has a relatively low unemployment rate, remember, 4.3% in March 2025, indicating a robust and engaged labor market. Although that low rate can also present challenges in talent acquisition. It means competition for good people.
Right, finding them can be tough. Are the costs still competitive, though? Or are wages rising too quickly, eroding that advantage for a multinational trying to manage expenses?
Well, wages are indeed rising in Hungary, which reflects economic development and talent demand naturally. However, the country remains notably cost competitive compared to Western Europe and North America.
Can you give an example?
Sure. To give you a concrete example, Romanian IT professionals who often compete for similar back office and IT-related roles in the region earn anywhere from 40% to 50% less than their German counterparts. And that's while maintaining comparable skill levels and productivity. This significant cost advantage, coupled with the high labor productivity often observed across Central Europe, continues to make Hungary an attractive option for companies seeking to optimize operational expenses without necessarily compromising on quality or talent.
And are there specific tax incentives that make it particularly appealing for foreign direct investment beyond just the general cost structure?
Absolutely. This is a big one. Hungary offers a very attractive 9% corporate tax rate. That's not just low, it's notably one of the lowest in the entire European Union.
9%, that gets attention.
It certainly does. This competitive tax environment has historically been a significant draw, encouraging major global players like Morgan Stanley, GE, to establish their financial service hubs in Budapest. Beyond this headline rate, the government actively provides various additional incentives, including a VIP investment cash subsidy specifically designed to attract and support large-scale foreign investments in strategic sectors, including manufacturing and shared service centers. It shows a proactive government strategy, at least historically, to pull in FDI.
So it sounds like the necessary infrastructure and the whole business ecosystem are already pretty robust,
Yeah.
supporting these complex operations. It's not like starting from scratch.
Precisely. Budapest in particular isn't just a burgeoning location. It's already a well-established and vibrant hub for technology and innovation. It proudly hosts significant offices for a long and impressive list of multinational enterprises. You mentioned Microsoft, Pfizer, IBM, Ericsson, many others.
Here are names.
Big names. This existing mature ecosystem means that new companies looking to set up or expand their back office operations benefit from pre-existing talent pools, established professional networks, and a supportive business community. That significantly reduces the initial hurdle and the time to market for new ventures.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty of employment laws. For a U.S. multinational, understanding the local regulations for their back office processes is absolutely crucial for compliance and just smooth operations. What are the key laws they need to be aware of, say, as of April 2025?
Right. Navigating the Hungarian employment landscape is vital. Hungarian labor law is quite comprehensive, generally designed to protect both employers and employees. Common contractual agreements include indefinite term contracts, these are the most prevalent type, offering long-term job security for permanent roles.
Standard permanent contract.
Exactly. Then you have fixed-term contracts, which are used for seasonal work, project-based tasks, or temporary assignments. But they come with strict regulations regarding their renewal and duration to prevent abuse. You can't just keep rolling them over indefinitely.
Okay.
Additionally, temporary agency work contracts are fully recognized. These provide flexibility for companies with fluctuating workforce needs while ensuring that temporary workers receive fair treatment and equal pay compared to regular employees doing similar work. Both employers and employees have clear obligations and rights explicitly outlined in these contracts, covering everything from job roles and responsibilities to working hours, compensation, and benefits.
What are the standard working hours?
Mm-hmm.
And how is overtime regulated and compensated? That can be a significant cost factor for back office teams dealing with deadlines or global time zones.
The standard work week in Hungary is set at 40 hours, typically over 5 days. Overtime is permitted, but it's strictly regulated to a maximum of 250 hours annually for full-time workers, although this can sometimes be extended by collective bargaining agreements.
And the compensation.
Crucially, it requires additional compensation. For overtime worked on a scheduled weekly rest day, say, a Saturday if you work Monday, Friday, employees are entitled to a 100% salary supplement, so double pay.
Double time.
Right. For overtime on an additional rest day, it's a 50% supplement. This ensures that while flexibility is allowed, employee welfare is protected, and employers have to account for the additional cost of those extended hours.
And the minimum wage and overall compensation structure, how are they designed, and what have been the recent trends? Is purchasing power keeping up?
The minimum wage in Hungary is subject to annual revisions, often influenced by economic conditions and social dialogue between unions, employers, and the government. As of 2025, the statutory minimum wage stands at HUF 200,000. That's roughly 536 US dollars per month for full-time employees aged 25 and
The
over.
younger workers.
For those aged 18 to 25, it's lower at HUF 150,000, which is about $402. A significant 15% increase for the minimum wage and a 10% increase for the guaranteed minimum wage for jobs requiring secondary education were planned for full-time employees, reflecting efforts to boost living standards.
And our average earnings rising.
Encouragingly, yes. Average gross earnings across the economy increased by 9.3% year-on-year in February 2025. This actually led to an improvement in real purchasing power for employees, which can positively impact morale and retention, even with the inflation we discussed.
Okay. Beyond the basics of salary, what about employee benefits and Social Security contributions? What statutory benefits are mandated, and what additional perks are common for companies like ours to offer to attract talent?
Statutory benefits, the ones mandated by the government, are quite comprehensive. They include sickness benefits, maternity and paternity leave, and childcare benefits, all supported by financial provisions. Beyond these mandated benefits, employers often strategically offer a range of additional perks to attract and retain top talent, particularly in competitive sectors like back-office operations.
What kind of perks are common?
Things like private healthcare plans, supplementary pension contributions, transportation subsidies or allowances, and flexible work arrangements, including remote work options, which are highly relevant and sought after for many back-office roles now.
Makes sense. And Social Security costs.
In terms of Social Security contributions, employers currently contribute 13% of an employee's gross salary, while employees contribute 18.5%. These cover a wide range of social welfare programs like pensions and healthcare.
How much vacation time can employees typically expect, and how does that affect workforce planning for multinationals needing continuous coverage?
Employees in Hungary are entitled to a minimum of 20 days of annual leave. This progressively increases with their length of service and age, reaching up to 30 days for employees over 45.
So quite generous compared to the U.S. baseline.
Yes, significantly more generous. This leave policy is important for workforce planning, especially in an environment where continuous service delivery might be paramount. You need to factor it in. Hungary also recognizes several public holidays throughout the year, ensuring additional paid days off for all employees, which must also be built into operational schedules.
And if termination of employment becomes necessary, what are the rules and procedures there, particularly regarding notice periods and severance pay? Protections seem quite strong.
They are relatively strong, yes. Termination of employment in Hungary requires specific grounds and strict adherence to legal procedures to avoid wrongful dismissal claims. Common grounds include mutual agreement between employer and employee, termination with notice, which requires valid reasons like redundancy or documented poor performance, or termination without notice, but only for cases of gross misconduct.
And notice periods. Severance.
Notice periods vary based on the employee's length of service. For example, it's typically 15 days for someone with less than 1 year of service, but it can extend significantly up to 90 days for someone with 10 years or more of continuous work. Severance pay is also strictly regulated by law. It's typically granted after at least 3 years of continuous work with the same employer, though collective or individual contracts can sometimes specify it after 2 years. The whole framework emphasizes job security and due process.
Finally, on the legal front, what about discrimination and equal opportunity in the Hungarian workplace? What are the legal protections in place for employees, especially in a diverse multinational setting?
Hungarian law strictly prohibits discrimination based on a comprehensive list of protected characteristics. This includes gender, age, race, religion, disability, or sexual orientation, aligning with broader EU directives on equal opportunity. Employers are legally responsible for ensuring a safe and healthy working environment for all employees.
What does safe and healthy encompass here?
It encompasses not only physical safety, but also promoting a workplace free from harassment and bullying. This involves compliance with safety regulations, conducting regular risk assessments, and actively fostering an inclusive culture. This is especially important, as you say, for diverse multinational workforces where creating that sense of belonging and safety is key. Okay, so moving beyond the explicit legal framework, the Randstad HR Trends Survey for 2025 gives us some valuable insights into the kind of pulse of the current labor market and the persistent HR challenges specific to Hungary. This raises an important question for you listening. How do these broader trends affect your company's ability to acquire, retain, and develop the talent necessary for your back office operations in the long run?
That's a crucial point. What does this survey actually say about Hungarian companies' expectations for growth versus their actual hiring plans for the coming year? Are they feeling optimistic, or is there a degree of caution setting in?
The survey reveals a bit of a mixed picture, a blend of cautious optimism. While a respectable half of Hungarian companies expect growth in 2025, which is a positive overarching sign for the economy, the proportion of companies planning to actively expand their workforce has actually fallen to 30%.
Only 30% planning to hire more.
Right. And conversely, a notable 10% of firms are actually planning layoffs, suggesting some economic contraction or restructuring in certain areas. An interesting and increasingly prevalent trend observed is what they call silent right-sizing.
Silent right-sizing, what's that?
That's where 13% of firms are opting not to replace employees who leave. Natural attrition becomes a way to reduce headcount without active layoffs. For a multinational, this could imply a tightening labor market for new hires. If fewer companies are expanding and some are shrinking quietly, the readily available talent pools might be shrinking. It means you need to be more strategic about talent acquisition.
Okay. And what are the biggest hurdles companies in Hungary are currently facing when trying to recruit new talent for their roles? Are they finding the right people with the right skills, or is that getting harder?
Recruitment challenges definitely persist, and in some areas they seem to be growing. Unrealistic salary expectations remain the most common problem cited by an overwhelming 83% of respondents.
Still the top issue.
Still the top issue, indicating this mismatch between candidate demands and employer offers, although it has decreased slightly from the previous year. But what's particularly concerning, and identified as a growing issue in the survey, is the limited or even non-existent work experience among candidates applying for roles.
Lack of experience, even for entry level.
Potentially, yes. This points to a deeper structural challenge, a potential skills gap, where entry-level candidates might lack the practical experience needed for specialized back-office roles. These often require specific process knowledge or soft skills that are best developed on the job. This implies a greater need for companies like yours to invest more in internal training and development programs to bridge that gap.
That leads me to ask about brain drain. With some of the political and social shifts we've discussed earlier, is Hungary at risk of losing its highly skilled professionals, especially from the segments of the population, maybe younger, urban, more liberal, who might feel alienated by the current direction?
That's a very valid and indeed critical concern for the long-term talent pipeline in Hungary. Despite various government efforts to encourage young Hungarians to remain in the country and build their careers there, the emigration of young, highly skilled professionals, particularly from those liberal urban populations you mentioned, could potentially accelerate, depending on certain political outcomes or prolonged social tensions.
And these are the people often needed for back office roles.
Precisely. These are often the demographics that populate the skilled roles in multinational back office operations: multilingual, tech-savvy, internationally minded. A significant brain drain would directly impact the availability of skilled talent for these functions over the long term. It makes talent attraction and retention an even more critical strategic priority for multinational companies, requiring proactive HR strategies and a real focus on employee engagement and making them feel valued.
Okay, so given all these factors, the political volatility, the economic headwinds, the HR challenges, what are the broader, more systemic challenges of actually doing business in Hungary? Beyond just the intricacies of employment laws we covered, what makes it difficult operationally?
There are several key overarching challenges that foreign investors consistently report facing. The regulatory landscape, for one, can be quite complex and at times opaque. For instance, that foreign direct investment, or FDI, screening mechanism, which was introduced back in 2022, ostensibly during the pandemic, it continues to create uncertainty for foreign investors, particularly in sectors deemed strategic like renewables or critical infrastructure. It adds a layer of approval and potential delay.
Bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy and uncertainty, yes. Furthermore, registering a company, while streamlined in some aspects, still legally requires lawyer representation in Hungary, adding a layer of cost and time right at the start. And some basic administrative processes are notoriously lengthy. Obtaining construction permits, for example, involves on average 26 distinct procedures and takes about 102 days.
Over 3 months for a permit.
On average, yes. And even something as seemingly straightforward as securing electrical connections for a new facility can take an astonishing 252 days, according to some reports. That significantly impacts project timelines and your operational readiness.
Wow. And what about the tax environment beyond that attractive 9% corporate tax rate? Is there anything else companies need to be aware of that might significantly impact their bottom line?
Well, while the 9% corporate tax rate is definitely a significant draw, it's crucial to look at the broader tax landscape. Hungary's value-added tax, or VAT, is set at 27% for most products and services.
27% VAT.
It's the highest standard rate in the entire European Union. This high VAT rate can significantly increase operational costs for businesses, particularly those with high domestic consumption or those providing services directly to Hungarian consumers. It directly impacts consumer purchasing power and thus market demand. It's a cost that needs to be very carefully factored into your pricing strategies and overall profitability calculations.
Corruption is also mentioned in our sources as a significant concern. How does that manifest in practice, and what are the specific risks for a U.S. multinational trying to operate cleanly?
Indeed, corruption is a persistent issue, unfortunately. Hungary is consistently listed among the most corrupt EU states by organizations like Transparency International. The country even controversially withdrew from the Open Government Partnership back in 2016 due to concerns about a lack of transparency and shrinking civic space.
What are the risks for a company?
This widespread perception and often reality of corruption can pose significant reputational and operational risks for multinationals. It can complicate day-to-day dealings, create an uneven playing field in areas like public procurement or licensing, and potentially expose your company to serious legal and ethical challenges if not meticulously managed. It's a risk that requires robust internal compliance frameworks and very careful due diligence on local partners.
And finally, what about the overall legislative environment itself? Is it stable, predictable, conducive to long-term business planning? Or is there a risk of sudden, unexpected shifts in the rules?
Unfortunately, concerns over the rule of law and what is often described as an unpredictable legislative process continue to weigh heavily on overall investor confidence, particularly for Western investors who prioritize legal certainty and predictability.
Like U.S. companies.
Exactly. As one source noted, these political risks add a significant layer of uncertainty to an already challenging business environment. This demands constant vigilance from companies operating in the country. It requires adaptable strategies and robust legal teams, internal or external, just to monitor and respond to potential sudden changes in regulations, taxes, or industry-specific rules that can emerge with very little notice or consultation.
Right. Which brings us to a crucial point, raising that important question. What are the concrete, tangible risks this complex political and economic environment poses specifically to your U.S. multinational operating those back-office processes in Hungary? Let's try and break down the implications across several critical areas.
Okay, sounds good. Starting with political risk. The upcoming 2026 election is clearly a major looming factor. How does the uncertainty surrounding its outcome translate into tangible, actionable risks for a business like ours? What should we be watching for? The 2026 election is indeed highly contested, and its outcome carries substantial policy uncertainty that directly impacts your operating environment. A decisive shift in power, say to the Titsa party, could usher in a more pro-EU and pro-Western stance.
What would that mean practically?
Well, it would likely involve efforts to unblock those suspended $22.5 billion in EU funds, which would obviously infuse capital into the economy. And it would likely involve initiating reforms to strengthen democratic institutions and the rule of law. For many international businesses, this would represent a potentially more stable, predictable, and favorable environment. It could ease regulatory burdens and improve investor confidence.
And the alternative, if Fidesz wins?
Conversely, if Fidesz wins, especially if it's a narrow victory perhaps perceived as less legitimate, we could see a continuation, maybe even an intensification of Eurosceptic policies, further centralization of power, and potentially the introduction of new or continued use of restrictions on foreign ownership in sectors deemed strategic. This could directly impact your business operations, your ability to expand, or even the scope of services your back office can offer if specific industries get targeted. The policy divergence between the two potential outcomes is really quite vast.
Beyond the election itself, the ongoing concerns about the rule of law and governance in Hungary, the things consistently flagged by the EU, seem to be a persistent underlying issue. How does this directly impact investor confidence and operational security day to day?
These concerns are absolutely fundamental to the business environment. The European Commission has consistently flagged significant deficiencies in Hungary's rule of law. They point to issues like a lack of transparency in the courts, insufficient anti-corruption reforms, and perceived political influence on media and judges.
Eroding predictability.
Exactly. It erodes institutional predictability and directly impacts investor confidence because businesses seek environments where contracts are reliably enforced and legal frameworks are stable and applied fairly. That new foreign agent bill, in particular, targeting foreign-funded organizations, adds another layer of complexity and risk.
How specifically?
For a multinational, this could create a very challenging operational environment, especially if your company engages with local partners, maybe contributes to community initiatives through NGOs, or even just indirectly interacts with entities that happen to receive foreign funding. It could expose your company to scrutiny, potential fines, or significant reputational damage. It makes thorough due diligence on all local collaborations absolutely imperative.
And how might the increasing social polarization within Hungary, which seems fueled by some of these political policies, affect your operations, particularly thinking about your diverse multinational workforce?
Policies concerning LGBTQ+ rights, media freedom, judicial independence, these have created deep and growing social divisions within Hungary. Under a continued Fidesz government, these social divisions may well deepen, potentially leading to increased social unrest or further marginalization of minority communities.
And the impact on a company.
For a multinational, this can have tangible effects on your internal environment. It could negatively impact employee morale, productivity, and ultimately retention, particularly within a diverse workforce where employees may hold strong personal views on these sensitive issues. Creating an inclusive and supportive workplace becomes even more challenging in such a polarized external environment. It could lead to internal tensions or difficulties in attracting new talent who are sensitive to these social dynamics.
Okay, let's pivot to economic risk. How does persistent inflation, even if it's slightly lower now, continue to impact the operating costs for a back-office operation, which often has significant personnel expenses?
Right. Persistent inflation, even if it's down to 4.7% in March 2025 from its peak, directly impacts operating costs, particularly wages. Even though the purchasing power of earnings improved slightly due to recent wage hikes, those gains can be eroded quickly.
And the government interventions, price caps.
Exactly. The government's interventions, like the current food price freezes, and those planned caps on services like insurance, while aimed at consumers, introduce significant market unpredictability for businesses. These measures could easily expand to other sectors, limiting your pricing flexibility for services you might offer or rely on, and potentially impacting profitability. Furthermore, the central bank's difficulty in hitting its inflation target means the cost of borrowing for businesses and broader economic stability remains under pressure, impacting your financial planning and cash flow management.
What about the broader economic stagnation and those uncertain growth prospects we talked about? How does that directly translate into risk for a business like ours focused on efficiency and maybe future expansion?
Well, low GDP growth, remember, a meager 0.6% in 2024, and the uncertain, often downward revised forecasts for 2025-2026, made worse by global trade wars and Germany's forecasted recession, directly affect market demand and future business expansion opportunities. If the domestic market is stagnant, it limits avenues for local growth or maybe diversification of the services you offer from Hungary.
And the reliance on China.
Right. While Hungary has been successful in attracting significant Chinese FDI, its increasing reliance on these investments, while a strength in one regard, could also become a significant geopolitical vulnerability for a U.S. multinational. Should U.S.-China trade tensions escalate further, your company could find itself caught in the crossfire, facing indirect pressure or just a more challenging operating environment due to Hungary's specific economic alignment. It's a geopolitical risk factor.
And the fiscal instability, we discussed the high deficit, low reserves, coupled with the ongoing suspension of EU funds. That seems like a major economic concern that could trickle down to businesses in unexpected ways.
It absolutely is. The government's ambitious deficit targets, coupled with those very low general reserves and the ongoing suspension of that massive euro and 22.5 billion in EU structural aid, mean that continued fiscal austerity, or perhaps more unpredictably for businesses, sudden revenue-raising measures are highly possible.
Like new taxes.
Exactly. These measures could take the form of new or increased special business taxes, sometimes called windfall taxes, which have been levied on sectors like banking, energy, retail in the past. These can directly impact your profitability or significantly increase the overall tax burden on your operations, often without much notice or consultation.
And the foreign borrowing adds risk, too.
Yes, the increased reliance on foreign currency borrowing to cover the deficit adds to exchange rate volatility risk. That directly affects the cost of converting local currency to foreign currency for payments or profit repatriation, creating another layer of financial unpredictability you need to manage.
Lastly, on the economic side, how does the foreign direct investment, FDI, climate factor into this, particularly for Western companies, like a U.S. one, who might be considering new investments or expansions in Hungary versus other locations?
Well, while Hungary has indeed been very successful in attracting Chinese FDI, often with significant government incentives and fanfare, that 2022 FDI screening mechanism and the persistent rule of law concerns continue to create a considerable degree of uncertainty for foreign investors, particularly those from Western countries who may view the regulatory environment as less transparent or predictable.
Making them hesitate.
It could make them hesitate, yes. It means that future expansion plans or even new investment decisions can become significantly more complex, time-consuming, and risky. It could potentially divert capital to other, perhaps perceived as more stable, locations in the region or elsewhere. For your business, this could mean higher hurdles for future growth within Hungary or even for maintaining existing operational flexibility if regulations tighten further.
Okay, finally, let's talk about the operational and employee risks for a U.S. multinational in this environment. How does the talent market respond to these political and economic dynamics, especially concerning long-term retention of key staff?
Well, while the labor market is currently robust on paper, with low unemployment, those social policies that might alienate liberal urban populations and younger professionals could, as we discussed, accelerate emigration, the brain drain. This directly impacts the availability of highly skilled talent for your back office operations over the long term.
So it's not just about hiring, but keeping who you have.
Exactly. This isn't just about finding new hires. It's about retaining your best and brightest, the ones with institutional knowledge and critical skills. The TISA party's emphasis on education reform suggests this is a recognized issue, at least by some. But regardless of the election outcome, maintaining a pipeline of skilled professionals looks set to remain a significant strategic challenge for your operations there.
And the political tensions themselves, can they actually affect employee morale and engagement within the workplace? It seems like it'd be hard to completely isolate a team from such intense external pressures.
Absolutely. It's almost impossible to completely insulate your workforce from such intense external pressures in today's connected world. Political tensions and the broader social issues that arise from them can definitely seep into the workplace, creating a challenging internal environment for employees.
How might that look?
It can manifest as increased stress, maybe division among colleagues, or just a general sense of unease or uncertainty about the future. This can directly impact morale, productivity, and ultimately retention. This is particularly true in a diverse multinational workforce where employees may come from different backgrounds and hold varying political viewpoints. Fostering a cohesive and positive work culture becomes an ongoing, active management challenge in that kind of environment.
With all the rapid legislative changes we've discussed, foreign agent bills, windfall taxes, potential price caps, what about the sheer compliance burden for a multinational operating there? Does it just keep getting more complex?
Rapidly evolving legislation, like the examples you gave, demands constant vigilance and expert legal knowledge simply to ensure compliance. For a multinational, this translates into a heightened need for robust internal legal and compliance teams, or significant reliance on external counsel, just to navigate the constantly changing regulatory landscape effectively.
More cost and complexity.
More cost, more complexity, and more management attention required. This isn't just about avoiding penalties. It's about maintaining operational agility and ensuring that your business practices remain legally sound and ethically aligned in what can be a very fluid environment.
And finally, what's the reputational risk for a U.S. multinational operating in Hungary? Especially given the international criticism the country often faces over rule of law issues, media freedom, human rights concerns.
That's a really important point. For a U.S. multinational operating in a country that is consistently facing international criticism for rule of law issues, restrictions on media freedom, challenges to LGBTQ+ rights, poses a significant reputational challenge.
How might that manifest?
This could be particularly sensitive for your employees, especially younger generations. It could affect your broader customer base, depending on your industry, and certainly your global stakeholders, investors, regulators, parent company, who are increasingly attuned to corporate social responsibility and ethical conduct.
ESG factors.
Exactly. ESG factors are becoming more prominent. It could potentially affect your brand image, your ability to attract new talent, especially those sensitive to these issues, and even your stand-in with investors who prioritize these ESG metrics. Managing this external perception becomes a critical aspect of your overall strategic communications and risk mitigation plan when operating in Hungary today.
Wow. We have covered a lot of ground today. From the shifting political currents, the potential for a real sea change there, to the economic realities, both global and local, and right down to the intricate details of operating a business and managing people in Hungary. So after all that, what's the one thing you think our listeners should really be mulling over after this deep dive? The key takeaway?
That's a great question. What's truly fascinating here, I think, is that Hungary genuinely presents this complex tapestry of both compelling opportunity and significant escalating risk. For a U.S. multinational with established back office operations, the absolute key takeaway from this deep dive, for me, is the heightened and pervasive unpredictability that defines the current and coming years.
Unpredictability is the watchword.
It really is. While Hungary undeniably continues to offer a talented, skilled workforce and that strategic geographic location that many companies find attractive, those fundamentals are still there. The intricate interplay of dynamic domestic politics, strong global economic headwinds, and the government's evolving response to both, especially concerning the rule of law, fiscal stability, and its international alignments. All of this demands an exceptionally proactive and flexible approach from your organization.
Not business as usual.
Definitely not business as usual. And this raises, I think, an important overarching question for you to consider moving forward. How will your organization strategically adapt its long-term presence and investment strategy in Hungary to account for these inherent dynamic uncertainties? How do you effectively balance the undeniable allure of a competitive operational hub with the very real potential for sudden, politically driven shifts in both the business and the broader social landscape? That's a tightrope to walk.